God has given each of us an incredible gift, and that is the gift of our testimony. The testimony is the story of our life before Jesus entered into our hearts and began to change us from the inside out. And then after, we see the picture of what it was that God intended us to become. And so today, Chris and I have the good pleasure to introduce you to Krysta. And now Krysta was a pivotal point in our lives and in our ministry. As you will hear, when God brought Krysta into our life, we knew that He had a purpose and a plan and a destiny for her that went beyond what she was living at that current time. And so, sweetheart, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And so, to start out, you have such an interesting and rich story.
Yes.
You've experienced things that not many people can even imagine going through.
Right.
And yet, God has given you the ability to share that story with other people so that they can have hope and they can begin to imagine their life beyond their current circumstances.
Right.
So if you would, sweetheart, in ways that you're comfortable, would you go ahead and just give everyone an idea of how your life started?
Yes. So it started in the womb, basically. That's how long Jesus has been by my side. My biological parents, so I was adopted as a baby, and my biological parents were drug addicts, so they were not able to care for me and my 3 older siblings. I was born addicted to drugs and was a sick baby. I had a hole in my heart. And with that came a lot of issues that would follow me the rest of my life. And one of them being a self-soothing disorder. So I was constantly crying. And before I was adopted, I don't believe that I was held very much. I was told that when I was adopted, I had, a bald spot on the back of my head, and my head was flat from being laid down too much. So that was the very beginning, and then being taken away from my biological parents, the only thing I really knew, and placed into foster care for a short time, and then I was adopted. A beautiful family. My adopted parents took me and my older brother and 2 older sisters in, and they fostered us. And I think it was 2 years later, my biological parents had another child, my younger brother, and he was also taken and put into foster care. And eventually, God orchestrated it to where my parents would adopt all 5 of us and keep us together.
And so, what a miracle.
Yes.
And because I know several of your family members and have met others, I just have such respect and appreciation for your adoptive parents, because the fact that they were willing to take in 5 in order to keep you all together was nothing less than an act of God.
Absolutely.
And also, they had children of their own.
Yes.
Already.
Yes. They had 3 daughters of their own. 3 daughters, and then they adopted all 5 of us, so it was a very large household. Made for a lot of adventures, a lot of fighting, a lot of fun, tears, all of it.
And so, sweetheart, you're adopted into this loving Christian family. And so does that mean from that point your childhood was just ideal?
And no, not even close. Well, I shouldn't say not even close. There's so many great aspects of my childhood, but like any other childhood, anybody else's family, there is dysfunction and there is trouble. And with adoption comes a lot of heartache and confusion and struggles to find your identity, a lot of issues, regardless of how loving your adoptive parents are and how blessed you are with the family that you enter into. Unfortunately, the trauma is still there, and until you get healing, and there's a lot of issues to work out. So it's definitely not perfect, but it's definitely a lot better than it would have been had I not been adopted.
So another event took place early on in your childhood, and again, just in ways that you're comfortable with, sweetheart. Would you go ahead and share?
So, my parents were kind of gone a lot. They both owned businesses, and so we had an older cousin who would babysit us. And me being one of the youngest at the time, I was in a vulnerable position to be a target, and he would take me up into my sister's room and sexually abuse me. And I know that it happened more than once. I have a vivid memory that I'll spare the details with of the first time it happened, but I know that it had continued to happen because I just remember him saying a code word to me and I would have to get up and go with him. And from that, I developed, well, I'm sure there was some anxiety anyway, but it definitely brought in a lot more panic and phobias and just severe anxiety. I would kick and scream and beg my parents not to leave when they had to go, but I didn't tell them what happened because I was told that if I did, then he would murder my parents. So imagine the fear that comes with that when you're about 4 or 5 years old, holding in this shame and confusion and not being able to tell the people that you want to protect you because you're afraid that you're going to harm them.
You know, thank you so much for sharing this part of your story, sweetheart, because we both know that there are lots of you that are watching this that have a similar history and experience in your life. And so with great compassion, we hope that you continue to listen to Krysta's story, and especially into part 2, where God really starts to heal her of some of these early childhood pains and traumas.
Yes.
And so your personality is getting shaped, and your temperament is being shaped, and so what kind of little girl did you become?
I would say more of a bully. I mean, I was a bully to bullies also. I didn't like other people being bullies, and there's times that I knew that I was being a bully and it was on purpose, and then there was other times that I think that, hurt people, and I didn't realize that I was actually, like, really hurting them, and other times I just didn't care. I just liked the attention that I got when, making people laugh or whatever it was, but...
So you had a bit of a temper.
Oh, yes. Even just as a little kid, if I couldn't put my shoes on correctly, I would throw them and rip my hair out and scream in frustration. And it was just really, really hard for me. I didn't like if I couldn't do something correctly. If it didn't work the first time, I felt like I was defective, and I would just be so angry with myself.
And so how did your parents respond to some of your struggles?
Honestly, I feel like I don't remember a lot of my childhood. But I do remember some of the times of me getting super frustrated and crying. I remember my mom comforting me and just like calming me down, and my older sister as well. They would like help me to breathe, and because I would be so upset that I'd be hyperventilating, and they would help me to calm down and to breathe and just reassure me that it's okay. And yeah.
So you go into school, and what were your school years like?
I had friends. As far as academically, I didn't really care to be in school. I didn't. There were times like if there was a challenge and I was good at it, then I loved it. Like I was good at algebra, and so I liked that. But for the most part, I honestly feel like my mind was somewhere else. And now, as an adult, looking back, I realize I was basically in survival mode my whole life. So to be able to sit down and concentrate and learn this information that to me was absolutely useless at the time, I didn't really pay attention or get very far. I basically failed.
So did you graduate high school?
I did, by the grace of God.
That's awesome.
In high school, I was doing so poorly because of some more trauma that happened that we'll get to. That I was such an anxious mess that my mom had to pull me out because I couldn't stay there, and I wouldn't have been able to graduate if I did stay there. She put me in a different school, but my anxiety was so bad that I was, eating by myself in the bathroom at lunchtime and lying and going to the nurse's office saying I didn't feel good because mentally I didn't. And eventually my mom just took me out. I begged her to take me out and put me in independent studies, and I ended up getting my diploma through that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned that something happened when you were in high school. How old were you?
I was 14, about to turn 15.
Okay. And so would you go ahead and let people know?
Yeah. So it was 20 days before I was about to turn 15, and I was with my friend and my boyfriend at the time. We had walked home from school, and we were at my parents' house, at my house that I lived at, and my boyfriend said, "Do you hear that?" And I listened, and it sounded like my sister was laughing really hard to the point that she was crying. And I went into the room and I opened the door and I see two of my biological sisters, bloodshot eyes, crying hysterically. And one of them bolts out the door, runs out the front door, and runs down the street. And so I'm automatically panicking, like, what's going on? Is our mom okay? Did mom die? What happened? And when I say mom, I mean my mom who adopted me, the one who raised me, the only one I've ever known. And nobody's giving me any answers. And so my anxiety is getting higher and higher. And then I see one of our foster sisters that we had at the time pull up, and, she brings, not great, but she brings out 5 packs of cigarettes. That was her way of helping everybody cope. And I tell her, please tell me what's going on. Is my mom okay? And she says, I'm going to let your sister tell you. And so to me, my mom's gone, and I'm shaking. And my sister comes out and tells me, I'm not going to name any names, but our biological mother passed away. She said her by her name. And I was like, Aunt? We don't even have an aunt by that name. And I think I was just confused and in shock. And she says, no, our biological mom passed away. She died of an overdose. And I was like, oh, I felt instant relief because I thought it was my adopted mom, the only mom I've known. And I automatically just felt so much better, like I could breathe. And then a couple minutes passed and it hits me wait a minute. We were supposed to meet for the first time, and we were supposed to hang out for my birthday. We both had this love for fairies and poetry, and we were going to go to OB and make necklaces, and we had just started writing letters back and forth and getting to know each other. And then it dawns on me, I'm never going to know the woman that I came from and how I relate to her, or what it was like. And then it started hitting me, and I started getting sad and crying, and my mom, my adopted mom, pulls up and just comes up and takes us in and hugs us. And it was just such high emotion, and my mom was so supportive and being there for us, and it was just intense, just like sadness and anxiety and just like trauma, just intense. And my brother, we called him, and he somehow already knew, and he was crying and freaking out. And a couple hours passed. I can't really remember how many hours. I think like 3 or 4 hours passed. And my sisters, my father took my sisters to go be with our brother, so that way they can all go be with that side of the family and be together. I stayed back. And while they were, right after they left, we got a phone call, and my mom answers it, and she's like, "What? Our biological father is dead now too." And I just broke down screaming, crying. I was terrified. One just died. A few hours later, another died. My siblings are already so upset and heartbroken that I'm panicking that it's going to be a domino effect, that my brother's going to kill himself. And so we hopped in the car, and my mom took us over to all be together. And it was just a very, very, very intense time. And that specific day and that time just completely flipped my world upside down.
And again, sweetheart, it would be impossible for anybody to imagine what that was like for each of you. And some of your siblings, being older, had a bit more of a relationship
Right.
with your biological parents.
Yeah.
But you, being among the youngest, had this potential
Right.
to get to know
Yeah.
her.
Yeah, I wasn't allowed to speak to them on the phone. Wasn't like a strict rule, but my parents were trying to protect us, the younger ones, just from being hurt, because they would often call while high on heroin and ramble, and she wanted to wait until we were old enough to be a little bit more understanding. And so we didn't really get a chance to meet them or get to know them.
And so that's what happened at that point where in school you just couldn't tolerate being in the classroom anymore.
Yeah, I developed like a phobia of getting a phone call that another person in my family, somebody that I love, died. And so I would be in class, and I would just start panicking, like feeling anxious. I couldn't sit still. I was just full of anxiety, and I would call my mom crying and just beg her to come pick me up.
And so did you attend the funeral for either of your biological?
Yes.
Okay.
Both of them. For my biological father, it was open casket, and I just kind of remember sitting there and really more so taking in and observing how it had affected my siblings,
Right.
and just being completely shattered and heartbroken seeing them like that, and then knowing that I can't connect with them like that. Like, I'm part of it with them because I'm their biological sibling, but it's a completely different world because I didn't have that.
Right.
And just seeing my sister like playing with his hair, and just crying. And I remember them holding up a picture, the last picture of our father that was taken, and he looked healthy. He was actually in a rehab when he overdosed. He was doing good, but I'm not sure what happened. He gave our biological mother drugs. She overdosed on that. He learned of it, and he went in his room, locked himself in there, and overdosed. Well, I believe took his own life from that. But just being at the funeral, it just broke my heart even more to see my siblings affected like that, and knowing that they're never gonna be able to be with them again.
And so what happened for you at home, and just what started to happen within your family?
There was a lot of division actually at that time. My sisters, who are not my biological, I don't know how you would pronounce that, my adoptive sisters. One of them was getting her feelings hurt really bad because she wasn't included. We kind of just felt like there had always been a separation with our biological family and our adopted family, that it was two separate lives, two separate things. And so we weren't really comfortable with them coming to the funeral, which now at the time I can see why that would be really hurtful.
Yeah.
But during that time, we were so wrapped up in our own trauma and trying to sort out our own feelings that we weren't comfortable. We wanted it to kind of just be us. And so that caused a lot of hurt, rightfully so. And just, fights of, you're doing this on purpose and you're not nice. You're trying to hurt your sister's feelings, and just a lot of division. And it was really unfortunate and sad. And now that I'm older and things have calmed down, I can totally see why that would be really hurtful.
And there isn't any map or any instruction booklet for us when something happens that's so unexpected and so traumatic. And the fact that it happened with your biological mother and then shortly after your biological father, that was just a completely unexpected hurt that you all were doing the best that you could to cope with.
Yeah.
And so, Krysta, what happened to you from that point? Did this affect your relationships with other people at all?
My older sister, one of my older sisters and I became very close, and we related to each other with alcohol and grieving. So that sister and I started drinking pretty often and a lot together. And we would drink and smoke cigarettes and just listen to songs that reminded her of them and myself somehow, and just cry and grieve. That's how we would grieve, is just drinking and crying together. And so that sister and I became very close.
And what about special relationships in your life? Did you start to form any bonds with anybody outside of the family?
So in the dating world, I, at about 17 or 18, pursued a relationship with a woman. I was in high school and I was drawn to her and attracted to her. And so I said, okay, whatever, I'm going to give it a try. I've never done this before. But that was a 4-year-long relationship and a very toxic and just verbally and sometimes physically abusive one. And spiritually, it was very toxic and unhealthy.
And because I got to meet you shortly after that, and that relationship was still very much a part of your life, I know that alcohol was a real feature of the chaos between the two of you.
So with her, I actually quit drinking. In the beginning, when we first started hanging out, like a lot of kids our age, we were drinking a lot. A lot of rebellious kids our age. We were drinking a lot, but then I started having really bad anxiety and like anxiety attacks, and so I quit drinking for the 4 years that we were together, but she did not. She drank a lot. And it was very unhealthy and just, I guess I just want to say toxic. That's the best way I could describe it. A lot of fighting, physically, verbally, just, I was very unhappy.
So, what started to happen for you that led you to the point where you knew that you needed to get help?
Well, the anxiety got so bad to the point where I would not go in vehicles with people. I wouldn't go into a car if there wasn't 4 doors that I could escape. It was like I was always trying to, there always had to be an exit plan. There had to be an escape, or else I wasn't gonna do it. I missed out on family vacations because I wouldn't go on planes. I wouldn't travel outside of San Diego, sometimes even very far within San Diego. I wouldn't get in the car with certain people. Sometimes I had to be the one that drove all the time, or I wouldn't drive. I started forming phobias that were just caving in on me and trying to debilitate me, and it was working. But I would say what got me to finally get help was in, I think it was 2007. I started drinking again, a lot, and I did overnight shifts working in the emergency room, and
And so, to explain what was your job at that
so
time?
I worked in the admitting department. So I just registered patients. I'd bring them in, or they'd come in. I would enter them into the system, give them their wristband, bring them over to triage. And I loved the job, but one day I was there, and I'm pretty sure I was probably hungover and didn't have very much sleep, and I just started feeling anxious. Well, I was anxious at work, and there was nowhere I can go to escape, and it just started festering and building and building and building, and I had a really bad panic attack. And that one specific one completely just destroyed me, and I was so terrified, and it made the anxiety that I already struggled with that much higher, and it was stuck up there, and I couldn't come down. And so I was desperate. Like, I was really desperate.
Now, if I remember right, there was another incident that you ended up being called to court to testify about.
Yes, I forgot about
That
that.
happened in that time.
Yeah. So, I believe that was before then. I'm not sure. I can't really remember the timeline if it was before that incident at the hospital or after, but regardless, I had these friends that we would hang out with, and there was 2 guys. There was a group of us, but there was 2 guys specifically. We all went to a party on, I believe, Thanksgiving, and these 2 friends come in, and they're like talking about, oh, we killed somebody last night, and everyone's like, oh, you're dumb. No, you didn't. First of all, why would you brag about that? Second of all, why would you lie about that? And, that's not something, if you did, that you'd be talking about and laughing about, joking about. And they just kept saying it, and we just ignored it. And then that night, this is when I was still with the woman, we went home. We lived together. We went home, and they had said, text me when you get home so we know you're safe, because they were our friends. And so we texted, and they said, okay, love you, good night. And then I believe it was the next day was my surprise birthday party, and we're all there hanging out, but they're not there. And I go, well, where is so-and-so? How come they're not here? And everyone kind of like started talking amongst each other like they were hiding something from me. And so I started demanding answers, because that's how I am. And eventually one of them told me, oh, they went to 7-Eleven last night and went in and shot it up and killed the clerk. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, I couldn't believe it. And sure enough, I looked and it was on the news and they had escaped. And so I was in conflict because these are people that I cared about, that I hung out with, that I, loved as my friends to some degree. And then they would do this monstrous act that, why would you ever go and do something like that? And so I was torn, but my stomach and my gut and the Holy Spirit, I believe, I couldn't not say something. And because I felt like those were my friends, but what I thought were my friends, the people that I would consider friends, wouldn't do something like this. Those are not the type of people that I hang out with, and I have to do what's right because that's what my morals are. And so I did speak to the police, and I ended up having to testify in court, and that caused a lot of anxiety too. I was terrified that they were going to come and retaliate, and I lived with my parents at the time, so I was so scared something was going to happen to my parents. I cared more about that than anything happening to me. I just didn't want my family to be affected. I wanted to move out of state, but it wasn't going to work out. They wouldn't relocate us, and it was a really scary time, but I had to testify and see them face to face, and it broke my heart, but at the same time I knew what I was doing was right, and these type of people are not my type of people.
So here you're describing just an overall a wonderful family experience, and a big family, and a Christian family where you're being raised in the faith.
Yes.
And so were you going to church all this time in your childhood?
Growing up, my dad was pretty persistent on us going to church. Was it our choice? No, not necessarily. A lot of times we would ditch class and just sneak out and do whatever and wait until it was over, or we didn't want to go to the kids' class. We wanted to stay in there with them. And but yeah, my parents always had us going to church.
So do you think any of what you were learning at church took root at all?
I'm sure that it did. It set a foundation to where that's where my beliefs were rooted. I knew that God was real and I believed in Jesus, but I didn't have a relationship with him.
Not just yet.
No, not yet.
And so, because one of the things that I know about you, Krysta, is that from the time that I met you, you always had a compassionate heart.
Yes.
You always cared about other people and looked for ways to be of help to them if you could. And so, does it seem like maybe there were some seeds that were planted that started to affect your choice, even to come forward and to testify in a situation that was really scary for you?
I would say that my dad planted those seeds. Yeah. He is a very giving person, and almost every Sunday after church we would go to like Burger King or Arby's, and we would just get a bunch of food, and we would drive to the park, the nearest park, and just go and hand it out to the homeless people, and just like watch how happy they would get, and it would just fill us with joy. And my dad would always hand over money to the homeless that are asking for it on the side of the road, panhandlers. And it was just a beautiful thing. Like, it wasn't something that he would go and tell people about or brag about, but he let us see what it's like to give to other people the joy that they would get, and then in turn what you get from seeing that. So yeah, I would say that my dad definitely had a lot to do with that.
And so even though your life is kind of spiraling out of control with some of the circumstances that happened, and it's getting more and more difficult for you to cope with those circumstances in your relationship, in just some of the tragedies that happened in your life, your dad actually takes the lead again
Yes.
and sees that his little girl really needs help.
Yes. So, this is where you guys come into play. So after that panic attack that I mentioned earlier when I was working at the hospital and how it left me in such a high state of anxiety, I really couldn't function. I lived with my parents at the time. I moved in with them after the breakup with the woman, and just never left. And then, so my dad saw me suffering. I made it very known I couldn't function. I needed help, and he basically swept me up under his wing and, would bring me to these different events. And he always wanted to bring me to a church thing, and I'm like, no, I need real help. I'm not okay in the mind. I need actual help. Well, little did I know. And then one night he suggested going to the healing room at a church that we used to attend. He still attended. And so I agreed to it. I was desperate and I wanted anything that I felt like could possibly help me. And so we went to this healing room, and lo and behold, the people that were going to pray for me were Chris and Regina. Am I allowed to say your names?
Yes.
And so they take us into this room and we introduce ourselves, and then I basically just start telling them what I'm dealing with, that I'm so anxious all the time, I can't function, and going into it. And then Regina's praying for me and she's crying, and I'm like, why is she crying? I've never seen anybody like cry over somebody else's pain like that. And it actually made me feel really good, like, oh, maybe she understands and maybe she could help me, And at the end of it, her and Chris whisper something to each other, and then she goes, we don't do this for everybody, but we really feel that God is telling us to give you our phone number, so that way if you need us, we're there and you can contact us. And I was like, okay, sure, put it in my pocket. I didn't have any plans to call. And then I'm pretty sure like the next night or a few nights later, I was starting a medication for anxiety, and I was so anxious. I thought it was giving me an anxiety attack, which was probably all in my head. And I decide late, I think like 9 or 10 o'clock at night, I'm going to call and let's see if she answers and what comes of it. And sure enough, she answered, and we spoke for like 2 hours, I think. The very first night, I automatically felt comfortable that I could open up, tell her about the homosexual relationship that I was in, because normally I felt with like Christians, that's not something that you could really say, but I didn't feel any fear or shame with her. I was able to just open up and tell her everything just in that night. And from there, we basically talked every single day, a lot of times, multiple times a day, and she just walked me through so much. And God, I honestly feel like if God didn't place Regina in my life, and Chris, he was definitely part of it, always praying in the background, and I really don't know where I'd be or if I'd be here at all.
And so, sweetheart, that's where we really start to see God begin to really get a hold of you and start to heal you and mold and shape you into the woman that you were to become.
Yes.
And for those of you that haven't met Chris and I, that experience with Krysta was something that was somewhat of a first for me, because people that know me, I'm not somebody who's really demonstrative or quick or easy to cry or something.
Right.
And it was really the heart of God for this precious little girl that just touched me so deeply that I was moved to tears. And Chris was the one who came over and said to me, Regina, she's one of yours.
Yeah.
And so I looked at him and I said, are you sure? And he said, yes. And so that's how it started. And I gave you my number. And at that point, I had started meeting with a few women and mentoring and discipling them. And so Krysta was a godsend for Chris and I, as much as she thinks that we have been for her. And we have been on this incredible adventure with her. And we're going to conclude part 1 here. And I encourage you to watch part 2, Meet Krysta, after, when we post it, and hear about how Jesus began to radically touch Krysta's heart and make changes in her that she never would have imagined possible.
That's the best part.
Yes, it is. Thank you, sweetheart.
Thank you.